Welcome to this week's lesson. This is lesson 9. The topic we'll be looking at today is the land use planning process continued, but we will be focusing specifically on industrial land use. So we begin by looking first of all at a definition of industrialization. So when we talk about industrialization, it is defined by sustained economic development where you have a focus on factory production, or in other words manufacturing of some nature, a division of labor, concentration of your industries in a particular area, also where you have certain population supplies as they contribute to your labor supplies in geographic areas, and those areas would also be characterized by urbanization. So below we have a brief definition of division of labor. So when we talk about division of labor with regards to industrialization, we're specifically looking at the separation of the work process into a number of tasks. So you're looking at your workflow. If you have certain tasks that have to be done in order to produce something, each task would be normally performed by a separate person or separate groups of persons who have been trained specifically for that task. So this is what we tend to find happening in the industrialized setting, whereas in traditional times you find that one person would usually carry out the entire workflow. But the division of labor in this kind of setting is what usually results in mass production and economies of scale. So let's look a bit at the history of industrialization. Most of you would be familiar with some of these pointers already, but it's just to kind of reinforce the relevance of these points and the impact on our environment and the land use process. So the Industrial Revolution, this took place between the 18th to 19th centuries during a period that was, prior to that was predominantly agricultural in rural areas of Europe and America. So this is where this is a part of the world that the Industrial Revolution began, and from there it spread to the rest of the world. And as we mentioned before, associated with industrialization is the process of urbanization. So prior to the Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain in the late 1700s, manufacturing was often done in persons' homes using hand tools and very basic, very simple machines. So when we talk about manufacturing, we're talking about cottage industry type settings where people would be producing their own textiles at home. Many times you find that the type of trading that would take place would be really bartering. They would exchange their items with their neighbors for different things, sometimes for food, etc. Industrialization also marked a shift to from manual labor to power, to particularly at this time to steam power, which facilitated the need for, or rather the use of machinery in factories, and all of this, as I said, contributed to the ability to mass produce goods. The iron and textile industries, along with the development of the steam engine, as I mentioned before, so that's steam power, played a central role in the Industrial Revolution, which also saw improvements in transportation. So for example, you're talking about steam power being used for the railway, etc., being used not only on the railway but also for water transportation. Communication and banking also improved. So now communication and even as we said, banking, now all of these facilitated the development of trade. So now that you can travel further distances, you can communicate with people in other countries. You have now grown your market, and as a result, it fueled the opportunity for mass producing goods. And as a result, you have this vicious cycle that's taking place as well. Also related to industrialization is the process of globalization. So as mentioned before, improvements in transportation and communication, all of this was facilitated by in the process of industrialization. And even today we live in a global society, and that means that because we live in a global society and we are so interconnected with each other in all parts of the globe, when things happen, often you find that there can be global impacts, whereas before the world was this global village, events would have more localized impacts, but now we find that there could be global impacts. And when you look, for example, at the world global markets, the stock exchange, etc., you find that what happens in one city, such as in New York, in Wall Street, can have global implications in China, etc., and vice versa. So while industrialization brought about an increased volume and variety of manufactured goods and an improved standard of living for some, it also resulted in often grim employment and living conditions for the poor and working classes. So we're still talking about in the early days of industrialization. So as a result, this promoted the rise of the labor movement. So this was a period where trade unions started rising up. They started being formed, and they grew as a result of a particular purpose. Their mission was to fight for improvements in the working conditions of many of these poor that worked in the factories and in these terrible working conditions. Let's look briefly at the industrial profile of Trinidad and Tobago. So Trinidad and Tobago, as we know, is a middle-income country. We are an energy-rich country, and we know that we are also very strongly dependent on our petroleum industry. We also have relatively strong institutions. Notice that says relatively strong. That would be defined by, for example, a certain level of transparency and rule of law and order within agencies, as well as a relatively stable political system. It is the most industrialized economy in the English-speaking Caribbean. Our energy sector, accounts for more than 40% of our gross domestic product, our GDP, and 80% of our exports. But it's only 5% of the employment. Alright, so that is a significant disparity there. 5% of the employment, the population of Trinidad and Tobago is employed in an industry that is so dependent, our economy is so dependent on. So as a result, this makes Trinidad and Tobago's economy volatile. We did touch on some of this in earlier lessons. That means we are a petroleum dependent economy, and that is actually a weakness in terms of resilience, our economic resilience, because it's never a positive thing to be so heavily dependent on one type of economic activity. It is the most important world provider of ammonia and methanol, as well as the largest supplier of liquid natural gas to the US. The benefits of large investments in the petroleum sector do not easily spill over to the rest of the economy, not creating comparably large numbers of jobs. So what we're finding is that you're finding all the wealth remaining in the petroleum sector, and it doesn't seem to be facilitating, or the rest of the economy, as we say here, is lagging behind. So for example, you find when you look at those who work in the petroleum sector, you find that they make exorbitant amounts of money. as compared to the when you look at the gap, the disparity between the petroleum sector employees and those of the rest of the lower paid employees in Trinidad and Tobago. These two sectors are not independent, that is, the petroleum and non-petroleum. For example, what do we mean by that? When we look at the abundance of natural resources and the development of the oil and gas sector in Trinidad and Tobago, this might be the most important cause for the underdevelopment of other sectors, meaning that really what we have going is too much of a focus of the powers that be in developing or putting all the resources into the development of the petroleum sector at the expense of other sectors. For example, we have seen in the past, historically, we see an underdevelopment in our agricultural sector. We see underdevelopment in our manufacturing sector. The country, Trinidad and Tobago, has made some effort to diversify the economy. But this is still lacking. I mean, there is still a whole lot more to do. Diversification, we know, is intended to spread the benefits of growth throughout the rest of the population. So as we had mentioned before, that great disparity in income, for example, between the rich and the poor, diversification is intended to try to even that out, reduce that gap somewhat. So a major concern for Trinidad and Tobago is the diversification of our economic activity. And this is important for us because it helps us prepare for the time when oil and gas reserves are depleted. Because remember, our oil and gas resources are finite resources. So let us look at the environmental impact of industrialization. So firstly, let's look at air pollution. So as a result of the activities related to industrialization, we find that we have increasing amounts of particulates from different things. First of all, such as the burning of fossil fuels from volcanic activity, etc. Also from power plants, auto emissions. So we have a lot of particulate matter, being released into the atmosphere. We also have a lot of gas emissions resulting from many of these same activities, including industry. And the consequences of these emissions into our atmosphere can be numerous. For example, we have the production of acid rain occurring. We have many respiratory problems and various diseases that can affect human beings. For example, when we look at the 1952 London smog, we know that as many as 4,000 people died as a result of the smog. We have chemical erosion of buildings and statues that can occur as a result of air pollution and acid rain. We have even our vegetation can suffer as a result. We have stressors that can occur and can result on our vegetation. For example, we talked about smog resulting from the particulates. Smog reduces the amount of sunlight that can come through the atmosphere. That affects your plants, therefore this hinders photosynthesis. It can also affect animals, etc. Water pollution can occur as a result of industrial activities as well. Where we have contaminations that are being released into our hydrosphere, into the various water systems around us, that contamination can often result in developmental problems in human beings through the consumption of water, for example, with heavy metals and other types of toxic compounds in our water supplies. We can have water related diseases as well occurring, such as cholera and typhoid, that would be caused by microorganisms in the water, other types of organic solvents and other types of toxic substances entering our water supplies. Our animals, marine organisms can be seriously affected. So we can have death occurring to our marine organisms. For example, we have an increase in algal blooms, and as a result, increase in microorganism growth, which we know would deplete the oxygen in the water, thus suffocating any marine organisms you have as a result. So we have eutrophication taking place. Global warming can also result from industrial activities. So just by way of reminder, definition of global warming: this is the increase in the average temperature of the Earth's oceans, land, and surrounding air, also called climate change. So we're all familiar with that. This is influenced, that is, global warming is influenced by the incoming and outgoing solar radiation. So where we have a disruption to that, we can have too much incoming and not enough going back out. This can also be affected by prevailing wind and water currents, atmospheric gases, clouds, volcanic gases from volcanic activity can be released into the atmosphere. Human activities such as industrial activities can be releasing these pollutants into the atmosphere. Every one of these contributing to conditions that trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere, thus causing global warming to take place. And we know that there could be many consequences as a result of global warming. For example, we find that there can be an increase in precipitation occurring in some areas. So for example, one that we are most familiar with would be an increasing flooding. So we can actually have an increased amount of flooding hazards and flooding disasters that can occur. We can also have the extreme opposite occurring, which would be a reduction in precipitation in other areas. That can lead to a spread of deserts and desertification. This can, as a result, affect agricultural activities as a result of drought. We find that the melting of ice caps can occur as well, and this results in a rise of sea level. And we know, as small island developing states, this is really a major concern for islands like Trinidad and Tobago because of our limited land mass. We also find that global warming can contribute to the spread of diseases. For example, where you have droughts, you can have an increased amount of airborne diseases. Where you have flooding, we know that we can have an increased amount of waterborne diseases such as typhoid fever and cholera. Additionally, global warming can cause changes in our ecosystems. For example, ocean warming and acidification of our oceans can cause coral bleaching and disruptions occurring to our coral ecosystems. For example, we know that ocean systems, to be healthy, require a pH of 8.2, and right now global figures show that our oceans are actually at pH 8. So we find an acidification trend occurring there. Weather patterns are altered as a result of global warming. We are seeing that in all parts of the world. For example, right here in Trinidad and Tobago, we find out there is no clear distinction between our rainy season and our dry seasons now. Many parts of the temperate world, which should be in periods of spring, some of them are still experiencing winter conditions. And then global warming can also reduce our biodiversity, because where you have disruption of ecosystems occurring, you find that biodiversity would be threatened. Acid rain is also increased as a result of industrial activity. Again, by way of definition, so acid rain refers to precipitation of all types, such as rain or snow, etc., that contains acids formed from the reaction of human-generated air pollutants with our oxygen and water. Right, so that's just a reminder. And what are some of the consequences, the environmental consequences of this formation of acid rain? For example, our vegetation health suffers due to an increase in mineral leaching at higher acid levels. So the acid rain leaches the important minerals out of our vegetation. Microbes in the soil would be killed as a result of the acid rain, so that reduces your soil health and soil quality. And we know all of this would feed right back to us in terms of our the quality of food that we as human beings get. Also, acid rain can have an effect on insects, as the insects would suffer evolutionary changes, and where the insects are affected, higher food chain members are affected. For example, insects are typically pollinators, so many crop yields will suffer without insects. Insects are also a source of food for birds and other animals. Insects also facilitate the decomposition of our organic material. So if there is a disruption to the population of insects as a regard related to acid rain, this can actually have a negative feedback to us as well. Acid rain also causes aquatic species populations to become stressed as the oceans become more acidic, and also acid rain, we know, can typically chemically erode buildings and statues in urban areas. And additionally, as industrial activities can also contribute to deforestation. So we know that what happens, you find that removal of forests would take place in order to facilitate industrial developments. The removal of forests and impacts on other types of habitats would also be done to acquire fuel, whether it's in the form of coal, etc. So a lot of developments, industrial developments, and also a lot of housing would be needed, because remember, we also said there is a close relationship between industrialization and urbanization. So a lot of land space would be cleared, and where that occurs, we have deforestation and also destruction of your habitats. Sensitive habitats and sensitive ecosystems are being disrupted, and we know there are many consequences that can occur as a result of the removal of our forests. So at this point, we have completed part 1 of today's lesson. I would request that you please proceed to part 2. Thank you.